Today we're going to be learning Beitzah Daf Hey. We have a very interesting daf, all about Rosh Hashanah related. The whole daf is all about Rosh Hashanah, which is great. You might, if you live in Israel, you might come to a mistaken conclusion from today's daf, so be forewarned. We'll get to that soon. Today's daf is sponsored anonymously for the yahrzeit of Shaul ben Kish, Shaul HaMelech, and Gershom Chaim Alter ben Shaul George Rosenberg, Rona Plunka's father. Okay, we are going to start with the very bottom of 3 lines from the bottom of Dalet Amud Bet. We saw it yesterday about Shnei, if you have a Beitzah Shenolda on Yom Tov, on the first day of Yom Tov in the diaspora. This we said, since in the diaspora we keep it Mishum Safek, right, doubt which day is which, then we basically say, Nolda Bezeh, Muteret Bezeh, because remember, if it was born on the first day, and the first day was Yantif, then today's not Yantif. And therefore, you can have the egg because today's not Yantif. Of course, it's permitted. And if the first day was Chol and today's Yom Tov, then it was born yesterday on a regular day and only today's Yom Tov, so it's fine. But now we're going to see 5 different opinions. 4 of the 5 are going to say it's forbidden on Rosh Hashanah. And we're going to talk about the different nature of the 2 days of Rosh Hashanah as different than the in the diaspora. Okay, and then the regular Yom Tov Sheni in the diaspora. Itmar. Shnei yamim tovim shel Rosh Hashanah, Rav u'Shmuel da'amrei travayu, noda bezeh, asura bezeh. When it comes to 2 days of Yom Tov and Rosh Hashanah, Rav and Shmuel both say if it was born on the first day, it's forbidden on the second day. By the way, today we're going to explain why we have a new fruit on Rosh Hashanah. Okay, that's going to be like one of the takeaways from today's daf. Titna, barishona hayu mekablim edut hachodesh kol hayom. In general, where does this all come from? All of this issue of second day of Yantif comes from the fact that they weren't sure what day was what. Why is Rosh Hashanah different? That even in Israel, they have 2 days? Because even in Israel, Rosh Hashanah happens on day number 1 of the month. When it comes to the other holidays, you have till the 15th, or you have on Shavuot, at least you have 6 days. It's enough time for people to find out about it. But if it happens on that day, it could be what would happen. Witnesses would see the new moon at night. They would come to the court to say, Jerusalem, I saw the new moon. What if you're coming from far and it took you a while to get there? So what happens is sometimes it would be later in the day until the word would get around, people around wouldn't know. So now there was a case where, and it's not just that, but even in the temple. In the temple, what was the relevance? The relevance, number 1, is you can't do malacha. Okay, so every time the last day of Elul comes, the 30th day of Elul, which could be the first day of Tishrei, comes and everybody keeps, Yantif, just in case. But in the temple, you have to know, besides you have to know how to daven. Okay, that's a whole separate issue. In general, remember, davening was a little bit less central than it was now, because they had korbanot in general. Davening was they did have davening, and they don't really relate to the davening issue. But they would take witnesses all day long, and they would basically, in the temple, you do the regular service. You do your morning, your afternoon, that goes on every day. It's not clear what they did about the musafim. Some people say that when it came to the korban musaf for Rosh Hashanah, so what would they do? They bring it al t'nai, conditioned. If today is Rosh Hashanah, then here are the sacrifices. If not, they were korbanot olah. So bring them as voluntary korbanot. Okay, and that was like another way to do it. But what happens? There's another issue that's very critical, which you might not have thought was so critical, but apparently it was. They said the wrong shiur. Okay, like you would have thought they didn't bring the korban musaf. Okay, and that's why some people say, because they don't say that, maybe it means they did bring the korban musaf. Other people say, it's really a question, why didn't they say about the musaf? But they seemed concerned here about the shiur. What's the shiur? In the afternoon, Rashi actually says that in the morning, they always said the daily chol one on the morning of Rosh Hashanah, because they didn't know yet. If Eidim hadn't come yet, first thing in the morning, they do the Tamid Shel Shachar, and they do a chol. Well, what happened? Remember, we talked about that if it's Rosh Chodesh and Shabbat, you do the shiur of Rosh Chodesh first, according to one of the opinions, because that's a way people will notice, right? They'll see, and then everyone will know it's Rosh Chodesh. So likewise, on Rosh Hashanah, if you get up on Rosh Hashanah and you do this shiur out loud, everybody hears, or everyone who's around there hears, and you did a shiur of a regular day, everyone's going to say, why on earth did we not do any work all day long? And now you're making us do it tomorrow and they're going to think that tomorrow is Rosh Hashanah and today wasn't Rosh Hashanah. And it's going to cause people to say, oh, why are we keeping this first day of Isra Malacha when we really don't have to? And cause all sorts of issues. So the Leviim sang the wrong Shiur. They sang a Yom Chol Shiur. Then it turned out, now what's the problem? In that year, it actually turned out that day was Rosh Hashanah because they came after Mincha. They said, we saw the new moon. The rabbis determined today is Aleph Tishrei, and they messed up because everyone thought as soon as they heard the Shiur in the afternoon, they realized, oh, it must not be Rosh Hashanah, and they started to do Malacha. Big mess. So hitkinu shelo yu makablim et hayidut ela ad mincha. Because of that one time it happened, they said, we're never accepting witnesses anymore after Mincha. Meaning, if witnesses come after Mincha, we don't care. We're not making, remember, the rabbis have the power to decide what day is going to be the day of the holiday. Even if the new moon was seen last night, they can determine the Rosh Chodesh is going to be tomorrow. And that's what they did. They determined, right, that we're not going to accept witnesses. And here's the key line. Nohagim oto hayom kodesh ulamachar kodesh. But they didn't want people to then say, oh, well, we're going to now, once Mincha time comes, we know you're not making it Rosh Hashanah, right? Rosh Chodesh or Rosh Hashanah. And therefore we'll start doing work, do whatever we want as if it's not Yantif. So no, they said, no. We're now instituting, and this is the key line to understand. We're instituting a new takana, okay, a new ordinance that from now on, now it's going to still if witnesses come until Mincha time, and then we can do the Shiur, and then everyone will know, and great. Then first day is Yantif, second day is not. But again, for anyone who will hear, anyone who's far away is going to have to keep 2 anyway. But in the chance that Eidim don't come till Mincha, we're making a 2-day holiday, even for people in Jerusalem, who are going to know that today is actually not the holiday, because they're going to know they were there in the temple and they see that no one came till Mincha. So they know they're determining that the next day is going to be Aleph Tishrei, the first day of the month. Doesn't matter. You're still going to keep both days sanctified. This changes everything. Why does this change everything? Because now it's only in the chance that, right? It still means some years people outside of wherever the range of hearing will be and how far people can get, it's still going to be kind of, a suffix. Like if it's the first day, then it's only the first day. However, since it might be that they're going to come after Mincha or the following day, we're basically going to keep both days sanctified. And this is not out of suffix, out of doubt, but out of a takana of the rabbis. That means that we're going to say there's one sanctity to both days. In other words, again, it's not every year it will be like this. But since sometimes it will be like this, and anyone outside of Israel has no idea, or outside of the range where they would hear, has no idea whether the first day was or not. And if they didn't come by Mincha, then the rabbis decreed it's going to be one long day. So basically they have to treat it stringently as if it's one long day. So there's like a little bit of a doubt here. Is it one long day or is it not one long day? But since it potentially might be viewed as one long day, therefore we have to be strict and forbid an egg that was born on the first day, also on the second day, because if it's viewed as one long day of sanctity, it's not like we say, oh, well, maybe today was, maybe tomorrow, we don't, and one of them for sure was the Yom Chol. No, because the rabbis now instituted that it's going to be one long day in the event. Again, it's only in the event that nobody comes until Mincha. So we now have, sometimes it will be one long Kedusha, right? Sometimes not. Sometimes it'll just be one day, but everyone's keeping 2 just in case, right? But since sometimes it will be, that means we're going to view this as one day of sanctity. Okay. What's the relevance? This is why I said about Shachianu. Why do we say Shachianu? We say Shachianu in Chutz La'aretz on a regular holiday, the second day in the diaspora, because either today is the first day or tomorrow is the first day. Therefore, we say Shachianu both days, both nights of the first day of any holiday, right? So the first day and the second day, you're going to say Shachianu. On Rosh Hashanah, we say Shachianu also, because maybe it's 2 Kedushot, 2 different, right? Maybe one is this is the first day or this is the first day. However, since there's this doubt that maybe it's one long day of sanctity, this Yom Arichta, in which case you don't need to say Shachianu the second day because it's just one long day. Therefore, because of that, we try to have a new fruit or wear new clothes or something else so that just in case our Shechianu can go on something else. That's the whole reason for this minha, because we're going to see different opinions about whether it's one long day or two sanctities. And even within this, it could be, right, depending on the year. Okay, but when it comes to an egg, we're going to be strict and say no. So again, just to review, and this is the second chart I did it on the page, Rav and Shmuel basically say that in the time of the temple and in the temple itself, if they came before Mincha, there would be one day of holiday only. If they came after Mincha, there would be 2 days, and the second day would be the first day of Tishrei, right? They wouldn't ever, right? If it was 2 days, they basically would determine the second day was Aleph Tishrei. That's not what we do. Right? Our first day is Aleph Tishrei. So we're going to have to explain that as well. And then anyone farther away would keep 2 days and viewed as 1 day, long day of sanctity, because possibly that's what happened in the temple. Possibly they had the 2 days, which was considered one long day of sanctity. That's Rav and Shmuel. But now we're going to have different opinions here. And they're all four of these opinions. Okay, the first one, I'll just kind of clarify for you. The first one's going to say it's permitted, the egg. The next three are going to say it's forbidden, but they all base themselves on something that Rav and Shmuel seem to have ignored, which is that this whole thing of Mina Mincha changed after the destruction of the temple. So Amar Rabba, Mitakanat Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, we've already learned about him. He instituted all sorts of these ordinances, changes after the temple was destroyed. So he said, right, like Lulav, all 7 days, and Yom Hanef was going to be all forbidden the day that the Omer was brought. You can't eat from the new wheat all day long. So from the time of Takanat Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai va'elach Beitzah muteret, says once Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai instituted this ordinance, which we'll see in a minute what it is, an egg is permitted on day number 2. Why? Ditnan, as it says in the Mishnah, Mishecharav Beit HaMikdash, Shitkin Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, Sheyihu Mekablim Edut HaChodesh Kol HaYom. Once the temple was destroyed, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai said, we have no worries about this shiur. Who cares? We'd rather make Rosh Hashanah on the exact day it's supposed to be, the day the real new moon was shown. Therefore, even if witnesses come after Mincha, since there's no shiur to mess us up with, so we're not in the temple anymore, so we can now accept Edut HaChodesh all day long, which means that at this point, why are we keeping 2 days? Because we don't know. Was the first day determined or was the second day? If Eidim come, it seems like until the end of the day, only day number 1 will be sanctified. Day number 2 will not be Rosh Hashanah. It'll be the 2nd of Tishrei and a regular day. Again, if you live far away and you won't know, so then you keep 2 days just in case. Okay, and that's Mishum Safek. If it's Mishum Safek, it's classic. It's here, we're just going to say, right, we'll make an analogy. Right? Rosh Hashanah in Israel is like every other holiday outside of Israel because they won't necessarily hear, right? Again, it has to be a place that wouldn't hear in time. So if you hear and you know. If you don't hear, then you keep 2 days out of a doubt. If it's a doubt, then we go back to Beitzah Shenolda Bezeh, Muteret Bezeh, because only 1 day is Chag. So he says it all changed with the Takana of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. So, Amar le Abai, we're now going to have a question on Rav and Shmuel based on this. Or we're going to really ask, actually, first we're going to ask on Rabbah, based on what Rav and Shmuel said. So Abai says to Rabbah, now Rabbah's 3rd generation Amoraim, Rav and Shmuel are the 1st generation, and they were known to be prominent scholars. So comes Abai and he says to him, Baha Rav Shmuel, the Amrit Travayu Beitzah Asura. But Rav and Shmuel both said that an egg is forbidden. So how could you say it's permitted when Rav and Shmuel said it's forbidden? To which he answers, Amarle, Amina Lachana, I'll throw back at you. Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, let me read it better. Amina Lachana, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. I'm quoting a Tana from before Rav and Shmuel. I'm quoting Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. Va'at amarli Rav and Shmuel. In other words, let's say put it in modern terms. With all due respect to Rav and Shmuel, I have someone earlier than them, more prominent than them to rely on. And almost like they're the ones who have to really answer up. How did they ignore the fact that this whole thing of Mina Mincha is no longer relevant nowadays? So, in fact, the Gemara says, Rav Shmuel Kashya Matnitin. That Mishnah really raises a question against Rav and Shmuel. To which the Gemara responds with a very interesting answer. Lo Kashya, Halan Halahu. Why do I say interesting? It's actually quite complicated because it's not so clear how this works. But I'll go with one of the explanations that's given to explain this. So halan halahu is almost always used, sometimes not, but often used Bavel versus Eretz Yisrael. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, where did he make his takana? Obviously, he was living in Israel. So in Israel, we're going to go by Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai that they will now accept witnesses all day long. And therefore, in Israel, it's no longer Kedusha Achat, because Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai changed things, okay, for them. And therefore, since they'll accept witnesses all day long, they're really only keeping 2 days, Mishum Safek, okay, in which case a Beitzah Shenolda B'zeh will be permitted. That's in Israel. That's how Rav and Shmuel, who are they paskening for? Bavel, not for Israel. So in Israel, they claim, okay, this is the way they explain Rav and Shmuel. In Israel, really, they keep, even Rav and Shmuel will agree, a Beitzah Shenolda B'zeh Muteret B'zeh. Because Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai changed things in Israel. But outside of Israel, where they don't determine the calendar at all, they have no power to do that. Only in Israel they do it. So if Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai said, we're now changing it, that you can accept witnesses from Mincha and on, that's only relevant to Israel. So in Israel, people keep 2 days out of Safek because they just don't know what happened or not. Since they will accept witnesses all day, they won't necessarily find out in time, so they keep it out of Safek. However, in Bavel, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's takana was irrelevant to anyone living outside of Israel. By the way, you have to say here that anywhere in Israel theoretically could set up a Beit Din to determine the Kiddush HaChodesh. Kiddush HaChodesh, the rabbis at some point determined in order to keep centralization of calendar. Could you imagine if we had 2 different calendars? It's already bad enough we have so many different opinions about everything. But if we had 2 different calendars, it would be a nightmare, right? It's bad enough, we have people keeping 2 days Yantif in Israel and 1 day Yantif, people come visit and things like that. But could you imagine if we had different calendars? So they said, we're keeping the rights to do the calendar, and in Bavel, you can't determine that. Which means that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's takana had nothing to do with Babylonia. Therefore, what? This is where the jump comes. Therefore, they're still based on the old takana. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was irrelevant to them. So they keep within what happened in the temple times, which is that there was one Kedusha, because the rabbis determined because of this Nitkal Kalu Bashir and that whole thing that happened, first they gave that ordinance, and that ordinance stayed in Babylonia. So therefore, in Bavel, Rav and Shmuel say, Beitzah Shenolda B'zeh Asura B'zeh, it's going to be forbidden because it's one sanctity. And in Israel, they've changed it back. Okay, it's a very interesting answer. It's a little difficult. I'll leave it there. It's not so clear-cut that one would say to do that kind of thing. But they're stuck in a corner because they really have to explain the Mishnah, and that's what they say. However, we're now going to see 3 more opinions, as I said before, who all think like Rav and Shmuel, the Beitzah Shenolda B'zeh Asura B'zeh, but for a different reason. They're going to take Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai's takana and say, yes, it's relevant to Babylonia also, or theoretically. However, there's a different reason why we're going to forbid an egg. And each one comes up with a different reason. So let's see. Rav Yosef Amar, but they all start in the same way. Af mitakanat Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai ve'elach Beitzah Asura. Right? Even though Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai changed things. And remember, the whole reason was because the rabbi said, we're not accepting witnesses from Mincha. Since we're not accepting witnesses, and we don't want you to then, say, oh, well, we're going to stop keeping Yantif now because obviously it's not going to be Yantif, right? They instituted, this is one long day of sanctity, so the people took it seriously. So now he says, well, even though Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai put it back to the way it was originally, that they could determine the new moon from even in the afternoon, late afternoon, still it's going to be forbidden. My taima have davar shebeminyan. There's a famous sugya in Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin, it makes sense. It's there because it's all about the courts. When the court determines something, even if they institute an ordinance for a particular reason, even if the reason is no longer relevant, you can't just undo what was done. You can only undo it if the rabbis kind of, took a vote. That's new. They voted and they determined that we're repealing it. So since the original ordinance was never repealed about the egg, okay, now it's a bit of an issue here. Did we ever say anything about an ordinance about an egg, right? What was the ordinance? The ordinance was, mina mincha, we won't accept witnesses, which means it's going to be one kedusha, which means that the egg is forbidden because it's really like one long day. And it's like a Beitzah was born today. and therefore we're going to forbid it, even though it's now tomorrow. We're going to view today and tomorrow as one long day. So we're going to ask that question later, that who said they ever forbade, an egg in, okay, that's what he basically comes and says is he's distinguishing, and Abai is going to question this, and we're going to be left with the question, but he's now distinguishing between the takana of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai to say we're going to accept witnesses from Mincha all day long, to the fact that he didn't say the egg is permitted, though, okay? He didn't say we're changing the nature of second day of Yantif on Rosh Hashanah. That's his basic theory. So before we get to the question on him, though, we're going to say, where does he get this from? And he's actually going to bring 3 proofs to which, where does he know that that davar shebeminyan sarich minyan acher latzilo? How do you know, right? It would be much more logical to say, if I tell you have to do something and you can't do something because of X, and then X is no longer relevant anymore, you would assume you can now do it. But the fact is the halacha is not that way. And from where do we learn this? He's going to bring 2 psukim from the Torah and 1 from a Beitzah, from a Mishnah. And then we're going to have to ask, why did he need all 3 of these? And we're also going to have to really explain how he proves from all 3 of these. 2 of them are going to be a little bit complicated. So, or at least the Gemara is it's not complicated. It's just the Gemara really doesn't tell us right away. They're only going to tell us later. But as I read it, I'll explain it a little so that I don't read something that makes absolutely no sense to you. But really, the Gemara is going to explain this more in depth in a few lines. So, Amar Rav Yosef, Mina Minala, where do I get this from? So now we're off our topic. We just want to know, what are the proofs for Kol Davar Shebeminyan Tzarich Minyan Acher Lahatziro? So the first 2 proofs are going to be God, basically. We're going to learn it from God, that God told us something that he didn't really need to tell us. Why did he do it? To prove to us that once something was determined, even if the reason is no longer relevant, you still need to be told to permit it. So here we have, Dichtiv. Lech emor lahem shuvu lachem la'olechem. Okay, go tell the people you can now go back home. This is in Sefer Dvarim when it recounts getting the Torah on Har Sinai. Now it says, a pasuk, we'll see it on the next page, says, Hayu nechonim l'shloshet yamim, be prepared for the next, in 3 days you're going to get the Torah. And then it says, Al tikshu alai isha, don't go near your wives, meaning separate from your wives for 3 days to sanctify yourselves. Which would mean that in 3 days, after you get the Torah, you can go back to your wives. But then the pasuk says, it says, Emor lahem shuva lachem lo alechem. Go back to your tents. Your tents usually means go back to your wives. You can now have relations with your wives. So here you see, they didn't really need it. Now, there's 2 ways of reading this. One is to say, why didn't they need it? Because it said 3 days, and therefore it would be obvious it's no longer valid after 3 days. And therefore God didn't need to say it, but he said it anyway, which creates a problem for the commentaries. The commentaries say, how could you even think that something that was time specific wouldn't run out without anything else? In other words, well, we weren't talking about a time-specific thing. We were talking about something that has a reason and the reason is no longer there. If it's really time-specific, some of the commentaries say, no. You don't need anything to repeal. If the rabbis make an ordinance for 5 days, when the 5 days are up, it's up. You don't need to undo it. They read this verse a little differently. Hayu nechonim l'shoshet yamim means be prepared. In 3 days, you're going to get the Torah. Period. Al tikshu alai isha, don't go near your wives. And that wasn't related to time. However, it was obvious that it was because of Matan Torah, and therefore, obviously, when they left and went back home, obviously they'd be allowed to be with their wives. The fact that God has to say it, Shuv lechem lo alechem, must mean that it needs to be repealed, okay, that it's not enough. And then it's not time-specific, because time-specific gets very complicated to think that you would have to repeal that. Okay. Next pasuk. Ve'omer, b'imshoch hayovel hema yalu bahal. Again, at Har Sinai, what does God tell them? Once the shofar blows, my presence is going to leave the mountain, and then you're allowed to go up the mountain. Before that, you're not allowed to go up the mountain, and that we'll see from what verse they get that from. It was clear they couldn't go up the mountain, and then God had to tell them, once you hear the shofar, then you could go up the mountain, right? Because once my presence is no longer there, you can go up. Now, again, it seemed obvious. Why couldn't they go up the mountain? It's not because the mountain is sanctified forever and ever and ever. It's just while God's presence is there. So you didn't need to be told when God's presence is no longer there, you can go up on the mountain. That was obvious. The fact that they're told this must mean it needs to be repealed. Third proof. Vitnan, it says in the Mishnah Maser Sheni, I think, right? Maser Sheni, yeah. Keren Revai. Keren Revai is kind of like Maser Sheni. It has similar laws. Keren Revai is the 4th year after you plant a tree. The first 3 years, you're not allowed to eat the fruits. The 4th year, the fruits have to be eaten in Jerusalem. So again, if you're in Jerusalem, right, what do? You eat them in Jerusalem. If you're outside Jerusalem, usually redeem them on a coin, and bring the money and buy fruits in Jerusalem. However, the rabbis instituted that if you live a certain distance from Jerusalem, which we're going to read right now, if you lived within a day's journey of Jerusalem, you would have to bring your fruits to Jerusalem. In a minute, we'll see why. First, they tell us the borders, and there's a little bit of a girsa problem here. If you have a regular Gemara, you'll see there's parentheses and stars and all that. It's either, and you'll see why in a minute, Eilat minat darom or Eilat minat safon. Okay, Eilat's in the south, but it can't be Eilat because Eilat is not a day's journey. So it's definitely not the Eilat that we know. But Eilat is either a place in the Safon or not. It says in the text, it actually says Elet with an ayin. Some people say it's Eilat with an aleph. Unclear what exactly it is. Akribat mina, either Darom or Safon, depending on which one it was north there, then this will be south. If that was south, this will be north. Okay, different versions of what exactly these are. Lod mina ma'arav, Lod from the west, and Yarden mina mizrach, and Jordan from the east. Okay, those are the borders that are considered a day's journey from Jerusalem. So Ula comes to say in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, what's the reason for this halacha? We wanted to fill the city with fruits. It looks beautiful to have more fruits in the city. So we wanted, right, if everybody brings their money and then they sell all the fruits in Jerusalem will get eaten. There'll be no fruits. And we want to have fruits to be able to make the city look beautiful. Now, when is this relevant? Only when the Jews rule in Jerusalem. After the destruction, when the Romans took over, it wasn't a Jewish city anymore, then it's not relevant anymore. So you would assume that once it's not relevant, so it's not relevant. But what are we going to see here? That they needed to repeal this, okay? And now we're going to see why. Vitanya, there's another Beitzah about this that says, Kerem Revai Hayalo Rabbi Eliezer b'Mizrach lo b'tzad Kfar Tavi. Remember, Lod is in the west. He was east of Lod, which means he was in between Lod and Jerusalem. Okay, on the side near this place, Kfar Tavi. Ubikesh lafkiro lanim. Rabbi Eliezer didn't want to carry it to Jerusalem because it was too schleppy. So he said, you know what I'll do? In order to avoid having to keep this halacha, I'll just say that all my fruits are hefker. They're no longer owned by me. I won't have to carry them to Jerusalem. And I'll give them out to poor people. And he'd rather get rid of his stuff than schlep it to Jerusalem. Amrulo Talmidav. They said to him, Rebbe, what's going on here? You don't need to do that. You can redeem them on a coin and take the coin to Jerusalem. Why? Even though you're close to Jerusalem and you're within the boundaries the rabbis determined previously, the rabbis undid that ordinance. They took a vote and they said, you no longer have to do this. Even though what? Even though in his time there was no temple anymore, it was irrelevant, but they still needed to repeal it. So what do you see here? First of all, they say, Man chaverecha, who are your chaverim who did this? Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, again, he was the man of ordinances, right? He changed a lot of things once the destruction of the temple. He said, oh, look, there's no longer a destruction of the temple, so you can bring your coins to Jerusalem, but you don't actually need to schlep your fruits. Okay, you obviously still have to bring your coins to Jerusalem. The halacha is still relevant, but you don't have to bring your fruits because there's no longer Shukei Yerushalayim. So what's clear here? Ta'ama dinimnu, they said to him, they voted on it, right? Halo nimnu, this proves that if they hadn't voted on it, they wouldn't have been able to ignore this halacha, right? They wouldn't have been able to say, oh, it's no longer relevant, I don't have to bring my fruits. So you see here that once they decided something, then you'd have to do it, then you'd have to keep, okay? What would they do with the money? They would bring it to Jerusalem and then buy food in Jerusalem and eat it, like Maser Sheni. You have to buy something that you can eat in Jerusalem. So now we have our three proofs. So we have the pasuk about go back to your wives, which didn't really need repealing, and yet it was. We have the pasuk about you can go up on the mountain now, even though that really didn't need repealing, and yet it was. And we have this thing about Kerem Revai, about bringing your fruits if you live close enough so that you can make Jerusalem look beautiful, which is no longer relevant when it belongs to the Romans. And therefore, it still needed to be repealed. So obviously, why do we need all these? So my ve'omer is a very typical structure, which means a typical type of question comes up many times. If you look very carefully at the words, it said, as it says in this verse, brought verse number 1. When it brought verse number 2, it introduced it with ve'omer, and it also says. So my ve'omer is basically saying, why did it need the second pasuk? Why did it say ve'omer? You could have just stopped after pasuk number 1. It would have been a good proof. So the Gemara says like this, Hachikamar, and in answering this, they're going to explain to us what they didn't explain on the previous page, which they should have, which is why I explained it then. But some of this is going to be repetitive because I already explained this to you. Since it already says, be prepared for 3 days, don't sleep with your wives. Why do you need to be told, go back to your tents? Isn't it obvious that now they can go back to their wives? Shma mina. So therefore, from the first pasuk, one can infer, right? It needs to be repealed even if the reason is no longer relevant. Now, here comes why we need a second pasuk. What would be the problem with that verse? Well, you might say, when he says, go back to your tents, God can mean one of two things. He could mean what we thought it meant, which is now you're allowed to go back to your tents. Or it could mean you should go back to your tents and have relations with your wives because of the mitzvah of Ona. The mitzvah of Ona is that one of the things a man commits to a wife in marriage is that when she wants to have relations, he's supposed to give that to her. So now the question is, what did God mean when he said, go back to your homes? Maybe he meant, look, you were away for a bunch of days. You left your wife by herself. You separated from her. Now you have a mitzvah to be back together with her. Not that it's permitted. Obviously it's permitted. But the point is, you should. I'm telling you that this is a positive thing to do. You should have relations with your wives, not just you're allowed to. Maybe you would say, maybe that's what it means. In which case you wouldn't learn anything about it being repealed. It was obviously repealed on its own. This was just God telling them something extra. So therefore, Tashma, that's why we have the second pasuk. Now, how do we learn it from this verse? Again, I told you this already, but now the Gemara is telling us. And there's a little bit of a problem here with the verses because this is in the second tablets and not the first. So you're going to have to do one of those ignore the order of the Torah kind of thing. Okay. So, and I'll tell you already, the commentaries have a lot to say about this if you want to read further about it. But it says, it says, even the cattle, the sheep and the cattle can't go grazing on this mountain, which means obviously people, even the animals can't go. And therefore, and why not? Because God's presence is there. And therefore, why do we need to be told when you hear the shofar, you can then go up? Shma mina, one can infer from here. So that's why we need the second pasuk. Because the first pasuk maybe you wouldn't have learned from. Therefore, we have the second pasuk. In case you thought the first pasuk was only about mitzvah ona. V'chi tema. Now, why do we need the Mishnah then? We have 2 verses from the Torah. That seems good enough. If you didn't like the first, at least you have the second. But v'chi tema hanimili b'deoraita. These are only deoraita. These are from the Torah. Aval b'derabbanan lo. Maybe you would think in ordinance by God. Okay, in this case, deoraita is by God. These were ordinances made by God. Maybe God made ordinances would have to be repealed, but by man, by the rabbis, maybe not. So Tashma Kerem Ravai. That's why they bring Kerem Ravai. Kerem Ravai de Rabbanan. It's only rabbinic. This whole issue that you have to bring the actual fruits and you can't redeem it on a coin. Was the rabbi said we want to have a lot of fruits in Jerusalem, and therefore they said it. So since you might have thought that, right? So therefore they say they brought this to teach you and therefore, right, they permitted it. You see here that they had to repeal it, even a D'Rabbanan. Now comes, this was all an aside, but really now we're getting to the end of Rav Yosef's proof. Rav Yosef wanted to say, remember, even after the Takana of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, we still view it as the 2 days as one long day of sanctity. So now we say, v'chi tema, and if you want to say, Beitzah nami imnu aleha, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai v'shur yuha. If you want to say when Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai instituted that we're going to accept witnesses all day long, maybe he also changed the whole nature of the day and permitted also the egg, because then it's all suffix. Remember that why are we keeping 2 days now? Either one day sanctified or the other. We don't anymore have this whole thing of one long day because it wasn't an ordinance of the rabbis that from Mincha, since we're not accepting witnesses, it's all going to be one long day of sanctity. So therefore, you might say maybe they also voted to repeal the issue. Matir the egg also. No, comes Rav Yosef and he says, and in a minute Abai is going to contradict this and would disagree with him. All he was talking about is determining the date, but he wasn't talking about the egg. He didn't come and say, I'm matering the egg. The egg was forbidden then. It will now be forbidden forever. To which Abaye says, what are you talking about? You're making it sound as if originally when they determined that because of the shiur and the mess that happened in the temple, they said, we're not accepting witnesses from mincha. You're making it sound like, and they also said, and therefore an egg is going to be forbidden, right? As if there was an ordinance about the egg. And therefore the date issue was changed. The egg was not changed. But comes Abaye and he says, Atu Beitzah b'minyan havai. They didn't, when they said, we're not accepting witnesses from mincha, nobody started talking about the egg, and an egg that was born on one day is going to be forbidden on day number 2 because it's all one long day. They never said that. And he says like this, Beitzah be'edur tal yamilta. Why did we say that the egg is going to be forbidden? Because it's dependent on when we accept witnesses. Since we won't accept witnesses from mincha, the rabbis instituted this is one long day of kedusha, and therefore the egg was forbidden. But ishtrei edur, ishtrei beitzah. But as soon as you permit the egg, which now you have, it was permitted b'minyan. So once you change the date, the edur will accept witnesses, then automatically the egg is permitted. So Abaye doesn't like Rav Yosef's argument, and we leave it at that. Now we're going to have, as I said, just like Rav Yosef, we're going to have 2 more people who come and say, even after the Takana of Rabban Yochanan and Zakkai, we're still going to say an egg is forbidden, but not for the reason he says, that because it needed to be repealed. Abaye just proved it really didn't need to be repealed because it was never an ordinance specifically about the egg. So comes Rav Adavar of Shalman, Travayim Libei Kluchit, that's where they came from. Amre, they said, Af mitakanat Rabban Yochanan and Zakkai ve'elach Beitzah asura. They start off just like Rav Yosef, that even once Rabban Yochanan and Zakkai institute his takana, the egg is still forbidden, even though really it's only sveika de yoma, right? It's only a doubt which day is which. But what's the reason? This is going to sound some familiar, like last time we saw Rabban Yochanan and Zakkai in Yom Hanef Kulo Asur. My time, Mehera Yibane Beit HaMikdash. The Beit HaMikdash might be built any day. Remember, that's how they felt in those days, right? They were waiting any day. We're going to rebuild the temple. V'yomru, if they rebuild the temple, what's going to happen? We're going to go back to not accepting witnesses from mincha, in which case it will cause a big confusion because people will say, they'll remember that the previous year they ate the eggs on the second day that were laid on the first day. So now we should also be able to eat the eggs. So they'll get confused by that halacha, and therefore they said the lo yade, and they didn't know, they wouldn't have realized they won't understand the difference. Okay, they won't realize that this whole nature, right? Which I'm sure not all of you knew that there's this difference of 1 kedusha, 2 kedusha, right? Some people learned this, but it's very unlikely that everyone in the temple is going to remember this, and they're going to think that the egg is permitted, right? Even if you knew, maybe there was some idea of this. I don't know if you knew about the egg, right? But the egg is permitted or forbidden based on whether it's 1 kedusha, 2 kedusha. So because of that, we're worried people get confused. Yes, thanks for Tova's comment. I should clarify what I said about, in those days, they really felt like it was going to be any day. We should be feeling that way. It's obviously more difficult for us to feel this way because so many years have passed since the destruction of the temple. What I want to show is they were in this time right after Bayit Rishon, it was 70 years, they'll already rebuild just like them. That's the main difference. Obviously now we're still supposed to be hoping that any day the Mashiach is going to come and we'll rebuild the temple. But the feeling of the closeness of it is very different than it was then, because they still had people talking about it and memories about it, etc. So now we're going to have so now the Gemara is going to have a question on this. Wait a minute. If you're worried that the temple is going to be rebuilt next year, in which case, right, that's not a worry. That's a good thing. You think the temple is going to be rebuilt next year, and then they're going to confuse the laws about an egg. Why? What else might they confuse? Maybe they'll accept witnesses from mincha. So they say, if that's the case, if that's the case, we shouldn't accept witnesses now. We should get rid of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's takana. My time, they'll remember the last year witnesses came very late and they accepted it till the end of the day. So next year when the temple's rebuilt, they might think that also. To which the Gemara answers a very classic answer, right? And then they'll think Hashanami Nekabel, we can accept witnesses. Oh no, that's not the same. Who determines, who accepts the testimony? The court. The court knows the halacha. They're going to know. They learn the rules. They're a court. They're supposed to be knowing what they're doing. Beitzah la kol masura. But the issue of egg is everybody in their own house will come make a mistake and eat the egg. That's much more likely the average person is going to make a mistake rather than the court. It's unlikely the court would make a mistake. So therefore, mina mincha, we could still accept witnesses nowadays, but we can't, right? But we can't say the egg is permitted because that will cause confusion once the temple is rebuilt. So his whole theory is because the temple might be rebuilt tomorrow, in which case people will mess up the halacha and people, not the court. Last answer. Rava Amar. Why? Same thing, but different reason. Milo modeh Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. Doesn't Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai agree that even if, until now we thought that what? If witnesses come before Mincha or after the temple, even after Mincha, before the end of the day, we will accept witnesses and say today's Rosh Chodesh and tomorrow's not. Comes Rav and he says, no. All Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai did was say, well, accept the witnesses to determine in today's Rosh Hashanah. But this 2-day thing of Rosh Hashanah, we're keeping. We're still keeping 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, even if we know for sure today is Rosh Hashanah, we're going to keep it anyway. Okay, he doesn't really explain why, but he says what he's basically saying is the takana was just relating to the date, not to the holiday. Okay, which is a very big deal. And I'll tell you why it's a big deal, because I'm going to read to you a section from the Baal Ma'or right now. The Baal Ma'or says something radical that you're going to be very surprised by, I think, unless you've heard this before. But the Rif says, I'll read you first the Rif. The Baal Ma'or is a super commentary or a commentary on the Rif. The Rif says, Rava Amar, okay, quotes the Gemara. Af mitakana Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai ve'elach Beitzah asura. Milo modeh Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai sheba'u edim l'machal shenohegim oto yom kodesh l'machar kodesh. Alma. Now he adds. The Rif usually just kind of uses the words of the Gemara and he brings the halachic sections. But here he adds some words, which is not as common for the Rif. He says Alma kedusha achati u'beitzah asura b'tchavayu. Okay, therefore it's one kedusha. That's obvious, and the Beitzah is forbidden on both. That's what he was trying to say, because we're still with our original takana that we're making one long day. But he says here, Vishamina miha, and you can infer from Divrei Rava that what? To b'nei Eretz Yisrael tzriche l'me'abad shnei yamim tovim shel Rosh Hashanah. And that's what we do today based on the Rif, basically. He says, one can infer from here that you keep 2 days of Rosh Hashanah even in Israel, because Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai changed, right? Because maybe Edim are going to come later and he changed the date, but we still keep this one long day. And even in Israel. Comes the Baal Ma'or and he says something radical. And he says, I disagree with the Rif. Okay? He says the following. He says, Ve'ein lanu shum ra'aya midivrei Rava al ma shekatav. We don't have any proof from what Rava says for the fact that the Rif says that now in Israel they keep 2 days. Because he says something major changed between then and now. What is that? Ela Bizman, Divrei Rava were only said Ela Bizman, Shayum Kachin al Pia Re'iyah. The whole thing of these 2 days is all based on what? A time when they check according to the moon and they determine the holiday based on the moon. But Aval B'dorot Halalu, but nowadays, Me'achar Shu'utkan Seder Ha'ibur, now we have a calendar. Al Pi Minhag Shenahug B'yadenu, Harei Chazra Kol Eretz Yisrael, Kebeit Havad, She'ein Lahem Safek B'Tushat Hayom. Since all of Israel could potentially be the ones where they determine the holiday. And he says, basically, anywhere that's in Chutz La'aretz, we still have to keep it because of this Minhag Rabbeinu B'Yadenu of the second day of Yantif. But us in Eretz Yisrael, or no, not us. He's talking about other people. He doesn't live in Israel. He says in Eretz Yisrael, there's no reason. We only have to keep 1 day, Bein B'Rosh Hashanah, Bein B'Shar Yamim Tovim. And the real key of what he says is, okay, he says for years and years and years in Israel, they only kept 1 day of Rosh Hashanah. Okay, this might change your whole attitude. They only kept 1 day, he says. Whether this is true or not, it's hard to know because not everybody agrees with him. But he says that's what they did until, what does he say changed things? The Chachamim of Provencia, when the people from Provence, which is right in between France and Spain, when they came to Israel and they saw people were keeping 1 day, they said, oh, this is a mistake, and they started keeping 2 days. Okay, and he says, historically, he claims that's what happened, and that really in Israel, there's no reason to keep 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. So I don't want you coming out of the Shiur and saying, oh, well, we live in Israel now, whoever lives here, and I'm only keeping 1 day, but you should know that the Baal Ma'or claims, and there's others who go in his opinion, that in Israel, you actually only need 1 day because this is only when they did it by the moon. But if you're not doing it by the moon, then there's no reason. And all you need is 1 day because we already know the date. And this, by the way, shows why it's the first of Tishrei and the second of Tishrei, right? Because it's not that we're worried the second day is Yantif, right? We already know the calendar. And we're only keeping this because the rabbis made this ordinance that we're keeping it. And that's why it's not like normally when you have a Rosh Chodesh, you have 2 days of Rosh Chodesh, right? You have the first one is the last day of the previous month, and the next one is the first day of the coming month. But this explains why it's just a takana of the rabbis, and that's why it's this one long day. And that's why we say Shechianu the second day with something else in case it really is just one long day and not Mishum Safek. So it's not 100% clear, and that's why we do that in between. Last line for today, Rava also says we paskin like Rava on these 3 issues. I'll just mention the last one here because that's the one we did today, which is the Chumrah one, right? The Kula one we saw yesterday and the one before that, the Chumrah one. But here's a Chumrah that a Beitzah shenolda on Yom Tov Rishon of Rosh Hashanah is forbidden on Yom Tov Sheni. With that, we end for today our whole topic of Rosh Hashanah on almost Erev Rosh Hashanah. Have a great day, everyone. I'll just remind you the Shiurim for Rosh Hashanah will be up after on Erev Rosh Hashanah tomorrow. I'll put up 3 shiurim in a row, basically. So make sure you follow which shiur to be listening to and not get confused. I'll label them all, but they'll all be up tomorrow. So if anyone wants to listen before Chag, you can. Have a great day. Shavua Tov.